Part 2, Chapter 8 of To Let. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Simon Evers. The Forsyte Saga 3, To Let, by John Galsworthy. Part 2, Chapter 8, The Bit Between the Teeth. To know that your hand is against everyone's is, for some natures, to experience a sense of moral release. Fleur felt no remorse when she left June's house. Reading condemnatory resentment in her little kinswoman's blue eyes, she was glad that she had fooled her, despising June because that elderly idealist had not seen what she was after. End it, forsooth! She would soon show them all that she was only just beginning, and she smiled to herself on the top of the bus which carried her back to Mayfair. But the smile died, squeezed out by spasms of anticipation and anxiety. Would she be able to manage John? She had taken the bit between her teeth, but could she make him take it too? She knew the truth and the real danger of delay. He knew neither. Therein lay all the difference in the world. "Suppose I tell him," she thought. "Wouldn't it really be safer?" This hideous luck had no right to spoil their love. He must see that. They could not let it. People always accepted an accomplished fact in time. From that piece of philosophy, profound enough at her age, she passed to another consideration less philosophic. If she persuaded John to a quick and secret marriage, and he found out afterward that she had known the truth, what then? John hated subterfuge. Again, then, would it not be better to tell him? But the memory of his mother's face kept intruding on that impulse. Fleur was afraid. His mother had power over him, more power perhaps than she herself. Who could tell? It was too great a risk. Deep sunk in these instinctive calculations, she was carried on past Green Street as far as the Ritz Hotel. She got down there and walked back on the Green Park side. The storm had washed every tree. They still dripped. Heavy drops fell onto her frills, and to avoid them she crossed over under the eyes of the Iseeum Club. Chancing to look up, she saw Monsieur Profond with a tall, stout man in the bay window. Turning into Green Street, she heard her name called, and saw that prowler coming up. He took off his hat, a glossy bowler such as he particularly detested. "Good evening, Miss Forsyte. Isn't there a small thing I can do for you?" "Yes, pass by on the other side." "I say, why do you dislike me?" "Do I?" "It looks like it." "Well, then, because you make me feel life isn't worth living." Monsieur Profond smiled. "Look here, Miss Forsyte, don't worry. It'll be all right. Nothing lasts." "Things do last," cried Fleur, "with me anyhow, especially likes and dislikes." "Well, that makes me a bit unhappy." "I should have thought nothing could ever make you happy or unhappy." "I don't like to annoy other people. I'm going on my yacht." Fleur looked at him, startled. "Where?" "A small voyage to the South Seas or somewhere," said Monsieur Profond. Fleur suffered relief and a sense of insult. Clearly he meant to convey that he was breaking with her mother. How dared he have anything to break, and yet how dared he break it? "Good night, Miss Forsyte. Remember me to Mrs. Darty. I'm not so bad, really. Good night." Fleur left him standing there with his hat raised. Stealing a look round, she saw him stroll, immaculate and heavy, back towards his club. "He can't even love with conviction," she thought. "What will mother do?" Her dreams that night were endless and uneasy. She rose heavy and unrested, and went at once to the study of Whitaker's Almanac. A Forsyte is instinctively aware that facts are the real crux of any situation. She might conquer John's prejudice, but without exact machinery to complete their desperate resolve, nothing would happen. From the invaluable tome she learned that they must each be 21, or someone's consent would be necessary, which of course was unobtainable. Then she became lost in directions concerning licenses, certificates, notices, districts, coming finally to the word perjury. But that was nonsense. Who would really mind their giving wrong ages in order to be married for love? She ate hardly any breakfast, and went back to Whittaker. The more she studied, the less sure she became, till, idly turning the pages, she came to Scotland. People could be married there without any of this nonsense. She had only to go and stay there 21 days, then John could come, and in front of 2 people they could declare themselves married, and what was more, they would be. It was far the best way, and at once she ran over her schoolfellows. There was Mary Lamb, who lived in Edinburgh, and was quite a sport. She had a brother, too. She could stay with Mary Lamb, who with her brother would serve for witnesses. She well knew that some girls would think all this unnecessary, and that all she and John need do was to go away together for a week-end, and then say to their people, "We are married by nature, we must now be married by law." But Fleur was Forsyte enough to feel such a proceeding dubious, and to dread her father's face when he heard of it. Besides, she did not believe that John would do it. He had an opinion of her such as she could not bear to diminish. No, Mary Lamb was preferable, and it was just the time of year to go to Scotland. More at ease now, she packed, avoided her aunt, and took a bus to Chiswick. She was too early, and went on to Kew Gardens. She found no peace among its flower-beds, labelled trees, and broad green spaces, and having lunched off anchovy-paste sandwiches and coffee, returned to Chiswick and rang June's bell. The Austrian admitted her to the little meal-room. Now that she knew what she and John were up against, her longing for him had increased tenfold, as if he were a toy with sharp edges or dangerous paint, such as they had tried to take from her as a child. If she could not have her way, and get John for good and all, she felt like dying of privation. By hook or crook she must and would get him. A round dim mirror of very old glass hung over the pink-brick hearth. She stood looking at herself reflected in it, pale, and rather dark under the eyes. Little shudders kept passing through her nerves. Then she heard the bell ring, and, stealing to the window, saw him standing on the doorstep, smoothing his hair and lips, as if he too were trying to subdue the fluttering of his nerves. She was sitting on one of the 2 rush-seated chairs, with her back to the door, when he came in, and she said at once, "Sit down, John. I want to talk seriously." John sat on the table by her side, and without looking at him she went on, "If you don't want to lose me, we must get married." John gasped. "Why? Is there anything new?" "No, but I felt it at Robin Hill, and among my people." But, stammered John, "at Robin Hill it was all smooth, and they've said nothing to me." "But they mean to stop us. Your mother's face was enough, and my father's." "Have you seen him since?" Fleur nodded. What mattered a few supplementary lies? "But," said John eagerly, "I can't see how they can feel like that after all these years." Fleur looked up at him. "Perhaps you don't love me enough." "Not love you enough? Why, then make sure of me." "Without telling them?" "Not till after." John was silent. How much older he looked than on that day barely 2 months ago when she first saw him. Quite 2 years older. "It would hurt mother awfully," he said. Fleur drew her hand away. "You've got to choose." John slid off the table onto his knees. "But why not tell them? They can't really stop us, Fleur." "They can. I tell you they can." "How?" "We're utterly dependent, by putting money pressure and all sorts of other pressure. I'm not patient, John." "But it's deceiving them." Fleur got up. "You can't really love me, or you wouldn't hesitate. He either fears his fate too much." Lifting his hands to her waist, John forced her to sit down again. She hurried on. "I've planned it all out. We're only going to go to Scotland. When we're married, they'll soon come round. People always come round to facts. Don't you see, John?" "But to hurt them so awfully." So he'd rather hurt her than those people of his. "All right, then, let me go." John got up and put his back against the door. "I expect you're right," he said slowly, "but I want to think it over." She could see that he was seething with feelings he wanted to express, but she did not mean to help him. She hated herself at this moment, and almost hated him. Why had she to do all the work to secure their love? It wasn't fair. And then she saw his eyes, adoring and distressed. "Don't look like that. I only don't want to lose you, John." "You can't lose me so long as you want me." "Oh, yes, I can." John put his hands on her shoulders. "Fleur, do you know anything you haven't told me?" It was the point-blank question she had dreaded. She looked straight at him and answered, "No." She had burnt her boats, but what did it matter if she got him? He would forgive her. And throwing her arms round his neck, she kissed him on the lips. She was winning. She felt it in the beating of his heart against her, in the closing of his eyes. "I want to make sure. I want to make sure," she whispered. "Promise." John did not answer. His face had the stillness of extreme trouble. At last he said, "It's like hitting them. I must think a little, Fleur. I really must." Fleur slipped out of his arms. "Oh, very well." And suddenly she burst into tears of disappointment, shame, and overstrain. Followed 5 minutes of acute misery. John's remorse and tenderness knew no bounds, but he did not promise. Despite her will to cry, "Very well, then, if you don't love me enough, good-bye," she dared not. From birth accustomed to her own way, this check from one so young, so tender, so devoted, baffled and surprised her. She wanted to push him away from her, to try what anger and coldness would do. And again she dared not. The knowledge that she was scheming to rush him blindfold into the irrevocable weakened everything, weakened the sincerity of pique and the sincerity of passion. Even her kisses had not the lure she wished for them. That stormy little meeting ended inconclusively. "Will you some tea, gnädiges Fräulein?" Pushing John from her, she cried out, No, thank you. I'm just going." And before he could prevent her, she was gone. She went stealthily, mopping her gushed, stained cheeks, frightened, angry, very miserable. She had stirred up John so fearfully, yet nothing definite was promised or arranged. But the more uncertain and hazardous the future, the more the will to have worked its tentacles into the flesh of her heart, like some burrowing tick. No one was at Green Street. Winifred had gone with Imogen to see a play, which some said was allegorical, and others, "Very exciting, don't you know?" It was because of what others said that Winifred and Imogen had gone. Fleur went on to Paddington. Through the carriage the air from the brick kilns of West Drayton and the late hay-fields fanned her still gushed cheeks. Flowers had seemed to be had for the picking. Now they were all thorned and prickled. But the golden flower within the crown of spikes seemed to her tenacious spirit all the fairer and more desirable. End of Part 2, Chapter 8. Recording by Simon Evers.
Chapter 9 of To Let. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Leanne Howlett. The Forsyte Saga 3, To Let, by John Galsworthy. Part 2, Chapter 9. The Fat in the Fire. On reaching home, Fleur found an atmosphere so peculiar that it penetrated even the perplexed aura of her own private life. Her mother was inaccessibly entrenched in a brown study, her father contemplating fate in the vinery. Neither of them had a word to throw to a dog. Is it because of me, thought Fleur, or because of Profond? To her mother she said, "What's the matter with father?" Her mother answered with a shrug of her shoulders. To her father, "What's the matter with mother?" Her father answered, "Matter? What should be the matter?" and gave her a sharp look. "By the way," murmured Fleur, "Monsieur Profond is going a small voyage on his yacht to the South Seas." Soames examined a branch on which no grapes were growing. "This vine's a failure," he said. "I've had young Mont here. He asked me something about you." "Oh! How do you like him, father?" He's a product, like all these young people." "What were you at his age, dear?" Soames smiled grimly. "We went to work and didn't play about, flying and motoring and making love." "Didn't you ever make love?" She avoided looking at him while she said that, but she saw him well enough. His pale face had reddened, his eyebrows, where darkness was still mingled with the grey, had come close together. "I had no time or inclination to philander." "Perhaps you had a grand passion?" Soames looked at her intently. "Yes, if you want to know, and much good it did me." He moved away, along by the hot water pipes. Fleur tiptoed silently after him. "Tell me about it, father." Soames became very still. "What should you want to know about such things at your age?" "Is she alive?" He nodded. "And married?" "Yes." "It's John Forsyte's mother, isn't it? And she was your wife first." It was said in a flash of intuition. Surely his opposition came from his anxiety that she should not know of that old wound to his pride. But she was startled. To see someone so old and calm wince as if struck, to hear so sharp a note of pain in his voice. "Who told you that?" "If your aunt—I can't bear the affair talked of." "But, darling," said Fleur softly, "it's so long ago." "Long ago or not, Fleur stood stroking his arm. "I've tried to forget," he said suddenly. "I don't wish to be reminded." And then, as if venting some long and secret irritation, he added, "In these days people don't understand. Grand passion indeed. No one knows what it is." "I do," said Fleur, almost in a whisper. Soames, who had turned his back on her, spun round. "What are you talking of? A child like you." "Perhaps I've inherited it, father." "What?" "For her son, you see." He was pale as a sheet, and she knew that she was as bad. They stood staring at each other in the steamy heat, redolent of the mushy scent of earth, of potted geranium, and of vines coming along fast. "This is crazy," said Soames at last between dry lips. Scarcely moving her own, she murmured, "Don't be angry, father. I can't help it." But she could see he wasn't angry, only scared, deeply scared. "I thought that foolishness," he stammered, "was all forgotten." "Oh no, it's 10 times what it was." Soames kicked at the hot water pipe. The hapless movement touched her, who had no fear of her father. None. "Dearest," she said, "what must be, must, you know." "Must?" repeated Soames. "You don't know what you're talking of. Has that boy been told?" The blood rushed into her cheeks. "Not yet." He had turned from her again, and with one shoulder a little raised, stood staring fixedly at a joint in the pipes. "It's most distasteful to me," he said suddenly. "Nothing could be more so. Son of that fellow. It's perverse." She had noted, almost unconsciously, that he did not say, "son of that woman," and again her intuition began working. Did the ghost of that grand passion linger in some corner of his heart? She slipped her hand under his arm. "John's father is quite ill and old. I saw him." "You?" "Yes, I went there with John. I saw them both." "Well, and what did they say to you?" "Nothing. They were very polite." "They would be." He resumed his contemplation of the pipe joint, and then said suddenly, "I must think this over. I'll speak to you again to-night." She knew this was final for the moment, and stole away, leaving him still looking at the pipe joint. She wandered into the fruit garden, among the raspberry and currant bushes, without impetus to pick and eat. 2 months ago she was light-hearted. Even 2 days ago, light-hearted, before Prosper Profond told her. Now she felt tangled in a web of passions, vested rights, oppressions and revolts, the ties of love and hate. At this dark moment of discouragement there seemed, even to her hold-fast nature, no way out. How deal with it? How sway and bend things to her will, and get her heart's desire? And suddenly, round the corner of the high box hedge, she came plump on her mother, walking swiftly, with an open letter in her hand. Her bosom was heaving, her eyes dilated, her cheeks flushed. Instantly Fleur thought, the yacht! Poor mother! Annette gave her a wide, startled look, and said, "J'ai la migraine." "I'm awfully sorry, Mother." "Oh yes, you and your father. Sorry." "But, Mother, I am. I know what it feels like." Annette's startled eyes grew wide till the whites showed above them. "Poor innocent," she said. Her mother, so self-possessed and commonsensical, to look and speak like this! It was all frightening. Her father, her mother, herself; and only 2 months back they had seemed to have everything they wanted in this world. Annette crumpled the letter in her hand. Fleur knew that she must ignore the sight. "Can't I do anything for your head, Mother?" Annette shook that head and walked on, swaying her hips. "It's cruel," thought Fleur, "and I was glad. That man! What do men come prowling for, disturbing everything? I suppose he's tired of her. What business has he to be tired of my mother? What business?" And at that thought, so natural and so peculiar, she uttered a little choked laugh. She ought, of course, to be delighted, but what was there to be delighted at? Her father didn't really care. Her mother did, perhaps. She entered the orchard, and sat down under a cherry tree. A breeze sighed in the higher boughs. The sky, seen through their green, was very blue and very white in cloud, those heavy white clouds almost always present in river landscape. Bees, sheltering out of the wind, hummed softly, and over the lush grass fell the thick shade from those fruit trees planted by her father 25 years ago. Birds were almost silent. The cuckoos had ceased to sing, but wood pigeons were cooing. The breath and drone and cooing of high summer were not for long a sedative to her excited nerves. Crouched over her knees, she began to scheme. Her father must be made to back her up. Why should he mind so long as she was happy? She had not lived for nearly 19 years without knowing that her future was all he really cared about. She had, then, only to convince him that her future could not be happy without John. He thought it a mad fancy. How foolish the old were, thinking they could tell what the young felt. Had not he confessed that he, when young, had loved with a grand passion? He ought to understand. "He piles up his money for me," she thought, "but what's the use, if I'm not going to be happy?" Money and all it bought did not bring happiness. Love only brought that. The ox-eyed daisies in this orchard, which gave it such a moony look sometimes, grew wild and happy and had their hour. "They oughtn't to have called me Fleur," she mused, "if they didn't mean me to have my hour and be happy while it lasts." Nothing real stood in the way, like poverty or disease, sentiment only, a ghost from the unhappy past. John was right. They wouldn't let you live, these old people. They made mistakes, committed crimes, and wanted their children to go on paying. The breeze died away. Midges began to bite. She got up, plucked a piece of honeysuckle, and went in. It was hot that night. Both she and her mother had put on thin, pale, low frocks. The dinner flowers were pale. Fleur was struck with the pale look of everything: her father's face, her mother's shoulder, the pale panelled walls, the pale grey velvety carpet, the lamp shade, Even the soup was pale. There was not one spot of colour in the room, not even wine in the pale glasses, for no one drank it. What was not pale was black. Her father's clothes, the butler's clothes, her retriever stretched out exhausted in the window, the curtains black with a cream pattern. A moth came in, and that was pale, and silent was that half-morning dinner in the heat. Her father called her back as she was following her mother out. She sat down beside him at the table, and unpinning the pale honeysuckle, put it to her nose. "I've been thinking," he said. "Yes, dear?" "It's extremely painful for me to talk, but there's no help for it. I don't know if you understand how much you are to me. I've never spoken of it. I didn't think it necessary. But you're everything. Your mother—" He paused, staring at his finger bowl of Venetian glass. "Yes?" "I've only you to look to. I've never had, never wanted anything else since you were born." "I know," Fleur murmured. Soames moistened his lips. "You may think this is a matter I can smooth over and arrange for you. You're mistaken. I'm helpless." Fleur did not speak. "Quite apart from my own feelings," went on Soames with more resolution, "those two are not amenable to anything I can say. They hate me as people always hate those whom they have injured." "But John—" "He's their flesh and blood, her only child. Probably he means to her what you mean to me. It's a deadlock." "No!" cried Fleur. "No, father!" Soames leaned back, the image of pale patience, as if resolved on the betrayal of no emotion. "Listen," he said. "You're putting the feelings of 2 months, against the feelings of 35 years. What chance do you think you have? 2 months, your very first love affair, a matter of half a dozen meetings, a few walks and talks, a few kisses. Against what you can't imagine, what no one could who hasn't been through it. Come, be reasonable, Fleur. It's midsummer madness." Fleur tore the honeysuckle into little slow bits. "The madness is in letting the past spoil it all." "What do we care about the past? It's our lives, not yours." Soames raised his hand to his forehead, where suddenly she saw moisture shining. "Whose child are you?" he said. "Whose child is he? The present is linked with the past, the future with both. There's no getting away from that." She had never heard philosophy pass those lips before. Impressed, even in her agitation, she leaned her elbows on the table, her chin on her hands. "But, father, consider it practically. We want each other. There's ever so much money, and nothing whatever in the way but sentiment. Let's bury the past, father." His answer was a sigh. "Besides," said Fleur gently, "you can't prevent us." "I don't suppose," said Soames, "that if left to myself I should try to prevent you. I must put up with things, I know, to keep your affection. But it's not I who control this matter. That's what I want you to realise before it's too late. If you go on thinking you can get your way and encourage this feeling, the blow will be much heavier when you find you can't." "Oh!" cried Fleur. "Help me, father. You can help me, you know." Soames made a startled movement of negation. "I?" he said bitterly. "Help? I am the impediment. The just cause and impediment, isn't that the jargon? You have my blood in your veins." He rose. "Well, the fat's in the fire. If you persist in your wilfulness you'll have yourself to blame. Come, don't be foolish, my child, my only child." Fleur laid her forehead against his shoulder. All was in such turmoil within her, but no good to show it, no good at all. She broke away from him and went out into the twilight, distraught, but unconvinced. All was indeterminate and vague within her, like the shapes and shadows in the garden, except her will to have. A poplar pierced up into the dark blue sky and touched a white star there. The dew wetted her shoes and chilled her bare shoulders. She went down to the river bank and stood gazing at a moon streak on the darkening water. Suddenly she smelled tobacco smoke, and a white figure emerged as if created by the moon. It was young Mont in flannels, standing in his boat. She heard the tiny hiss of his cigarette extinguished in the water. "Fleur," came his voice, Don't be hard on a poor devil. I've been waiting hours." "For what?" "Come in my boat." "Not I." "Why not?" "I'm not a water nymph." "Haven't you any romance in you? Don't be modern, Fleur." He appeared on the path within a yard of her. "Go away." "Fleur, I love you. Fleur." Fleur uttered a short laugh. "Come again," she said, "when I haven't got my wish." "What is your wish?" "Ask another." "Fleur," said Mont, and his voice sounded strange, "don't mock me. Even vivisected dogs are worth decent treatment before they're cut up for good." Fleur shook her head, but her lips were trembling. "Well, you shouldn't make me jump. Give me a cigarette." Mont gave her one, lighted it, and another for himself. "I don't want to talk rot," he said, "but please imagine all the rot that all the lovers that ever were have talked, and all my special rot thrown in." "Thank you, I have imagined it. Good night." They stood for a moment facing each other in the shadow of an acacia tree with very moonlit blossoms, and the smoke from their cigarettes mingled in the air between them. "Also Wren. Michael Mont?" he said. Fleur turned abruptly toward the house. On the lawn she stopped to look back. Michael Mont was whirling his arms above him; she could see them dashing at his head, then waving at the moonlit blossoms of the acacia. His voice just reached her. "Jolly, jolly!" Fleur shook herself. She couldn't help him. She had too much trouble of her own. On the veranda she stopped very suddenly again. Her mother was sitting in the drawing-room at her writing bureau, quite alone. There was nothing remarkable in the expression of her face except its utter immobility. But she looked desolate. Fleur went upstairs. At the door of her room she paused. She could hear her father walking up and down the picture gallery. Yes, she thought, jolly. Oh, John. End of Part 2, Chapter 9. Recording by Leanne Howlett.
Part 2, Chapter 10 of To Let. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Andy Minter. The Forsyte Saga. 3. To Let by John Galsworthy. Part 2, Chapter 10. Decision. When Fleur left him, John stared at the Austrian. She was a thin woman, with a dark face, and the concerned expression of one who has watched every little good that life once had slip from her, one by one. "No tea?" she said. Susceptible to the disappointment in her voice, John murmured, "No, really, thanks." "A little cup, it ready? A little cup and cigarette." Fleur was gone. Hours of remorse and indecision lay before him, and with a heavy sense of disproportion he smiled and said, "Well, thank you." She brought in a little pot of tea with 2 little cups, and a silver box of cigarettes on a little tray. "Sugar? Miss Forsyte has much sugar. She buy my sugar, my friend's sugar also. Miss Forsyte is a very kind lady. I am happy to serve her. You her brother?" "Yes," said John, beginning to puff the second cigarette of his life. "A very young brother," said the Austrian, with a little anxious smile, which reminded him of the wag of a dog's tail. "May I give you some?" he said, "and won't you sit down, please?" The Austrian shook her head. "Your father, a very nice old man, the most nice old man I ever see. Miss Forsyte, tell me all about him. Is he better?" Her words fell on John like a reproach. "Oh, yes, I think he's all right." "I like to see him again," said the Austrian, putting a hand on her heart. "He have very kind heart." "Yes," said John, and again her words seemed to him a reproach. "He never give no trouble to no one, and smile so gentle." Yes, doesn't he? He look at Miss Forsyte so funny sometimes. I tell him all my story. He so sympathetic. Your mother, she nice and well? Yes, very. He have her photograph on his dressing table. Very beautiful. John gulped down his tea. This woman, with her concerned face and her reminding words, was like the first and second murderers. "Thank you," he said. "I must go now. May I leave this with you?" He put a 10-shilling note on the tray with a doubting hand, and gained the door. He heard the Austrian gasp, and hurried out. He had just time to catch his train, and all the way to Victoria looked at every face that passed, as lovers will, hoping against hope. On reaching Worthing, he put his luggage into the local train, and set out across the Downs for Wansdon, trying to walk off his aching irresolution. So long as he went full bat, he could enjoy the beauty of those green slopes, stopping now and again to sprawl on the grass, admire the perfection of a wild rose, or listen to a lark's song. But the war of motives within him was but postponed, the longing for Fleur and the hatred of deception. He came to the old chalk pit above Wansdon, with his mind no more made up than when he started. To see both sides of a question vigorously was at once John's strength and weakness. He tramped in just as the first dinner bell rang. His things had already been brought up. He had a hurried bath, and came down to find Holly alone. Val had gone to town, and would not be back till the last train. Since Val's advice to him to ask his sister what was the matter between the two families, so much had happened. Fleur's disclosure in the Green Park, her visit to Robin Hill, today's meeting, that there seemed nothing to ask. He talked of Spain, his sunstroke, Val's horses, their father's health. Holly startled him by saying that she thought their father was not at all well. She had been twice to Robin Hill for the week-end. He had seemed fearfully languid, sometimes even in pain, but had always refused to talk about himself. "He's so awfully dear and unselfish, don't you think, John?" Feeling far from dear and unselfish himself, John answered, "Rather. I think he's been a simply perfect father so long as I can remember." "Yes," answered John, very subdued. "He never interfered, and he's always seemed to understand. I shall never forget his letting me go to South Africa and the Boer War when I was in love with Val." "That was before he married Mother, wasn't it?" said John suddenly. "Yes. Why?" "Oh, nothing. Only, wasn't she engaged to Fleur's father first?" Holly put down the spoon she was using, and raised her eyes. Her stare was circumspect. What did the boy know? Enough to make it better to tell him? She could not decide. He looked strained and worried, altogether older, but that might be the sunstroke. "There was something," she said. "Of course, we were out there and got no news of anything." She could not take the risk. It was not her secret. Besides, she was in the dark about his feelings now. Before Spain, she had made sure he was in love. But boys were boys. That was 7 weeks ago, and all Spain between. She saw that he knew she was putting him off, and added, "Have you heard anything of Fleur?" "Yes." His face told her then more than the most elaborate explanations. So he had not forgotten. She said very quietly, "Fleur is awfully attractive, John, but, you know, Val and I don't really like her very much." "Why?" "We think she's got rather a having nature." "Having? I don't know what you mean. She..." He pushed his dessert plate away, got up and went to the window. Holly too got up and put her arm round his waist. "Don't be angry, John dear. We can't all see people in the same light, can we? You know, I believe each of us only has about 1 or 2 people who can see the best that's in us and bring it out. For you, I think it's your mother. I once saw her looking at a letter of yours. It was wonderful to see her face. I think she's the most beautiful woman I ever saw. Age doesn't seem to touch her." John's face softened, then again became tense. Everybody was against him and Fleur. It all strengthened the appeal of her words. "Make sure of me. Marry me, John." Here, where he had passed that wonderful week with her, the tug of her enchantment, the ache in his heart, increased with every minute that she was not there to make the room, the garden, the very air magical. Would he ever be able to live down here, not seeing her? And he closed up utterly, going early to bed. It would not make him healthy, wealthy, and wise, but it closeted him with memory of Fleur in her fancy frock. He heard Val's arrival, the Ford discharging cargo. Then the stillness of the summer night stole back, with only the bleating of very distant sheep, and a nightjar's harsh purring. He leant far out. Cold moon, warm air, the downs like silver, small wings, a stream bubbling, the rambler roses. God, how empty all of it without her! In the Bible it was written, "Thou shalt leave father and mother and cleave to—" Fleur. Let him have pluck and go and tell them. They couldn't stop him marrying her. They wouldn't want to stop him when they knew how he felt. Yes, he would go, bold and open. Fleur was wrong. The nightjar ceased. The sheep were silent. The only sound in the darkness was the bubbling of the stream. And John, in his bed, slept, freed from the worst of life's evils. Indecision. End of Part 2, Chapter 10. 2, Chapter 11 of To Let. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Andy Minter. The Forsyte Saga. 3. To Let, by John Galsworthy. Part 2, Chapter 11. Timothy Prophesies. On the day of the cancelled meeting at the National Gallery began the second anniversary of the resurrection of England's pride and glory, or more shortly, the top hat. Lord's, that festival which the war had driven from the field, raised its light and dark blue flags for the second time, displaying almost every feature of a glorious past. Here, in the luncheon interval, were all species of female and one species of male hat, protecting the multiple types of face associated with the classes. The observing Forsyte might discern in the free or unconsidered seats a certain number of the squash-hatted, but they hardly ventured on to the grass. The old school, or schools, could still rejoice that the proletariat was not yet paying the necessary half-crown. Here was still a close borough, the only one left on a large scale, for the papers were about to estimate the attendance at 10,000. And the 10,000, all animated by one hope, were asking each other one question: "Where are you lunching?" Something wonderfully uplifting and reassuring in that query, and the sight of so many people, like themselves, voicing it. What reserve power in the British realm! Enough pigeons, lobsters, lamb, salmon mayonnaise, strawberries, and bottles of champagne to feed the lot. No miracle in prospect, no case of 7 loaves and a few fishes. Faith rested on surer foundations. 6,000 top hats, 4,000 parasols would be doffed and furled. 10,000 mouths, all speaking the same English, would be filled. There was life in the old dog yet. Tradition, and again tradition. How strong and how elastic! Wars might rage, taxation prey, trades unions take toll, and Europe perish of starvation, but the 10,000 would be fed, and within their ring fence stroll upon green turf, wear their top hats, and meet themselves. The heart was sound, the pulse regular. Eton, Eton, Harrow! Among the many Forsytes present on a hunting ground theirs by personal prescriptive right, or proxy, was Soames, with his wife and daughter. He had not been at either school. He took no interest in cricket, But he wanted Fleur to show her frock, and he wanted to wear his top hat, parade it again in peace and plenty among his peers. He walked sedately, with Fleur between him and Annette. No women equalled them, so far as he could see. They could walk and hold themselves up. There was substance in their good looks. The modern woman had no build, no chest, no anything. He remembered suddenly with what intoxication of pride he had walked round with Irene in the first years of his first marriage, and how they used to lunch on the drag which his mother would make his father have, because it was so chic. All drags and carriages in those days, not these lumbering great stands. And how consistently Montague Dartie had drunk too much. He supposed that people drank too much still, but there was not the scope for it there used to be. He remembered George Forsyte, whose brothers Roger and Euston had been at Harrow and Eton, towering up on the top of the drag, waving a light blue flag with one hand and a dark blue flag with the other, and shouting "Etro! Hareton!" just when everybody was silent, like the buffoon he had always been. And Eustace got up to the nines below, too dandified to wear any colour or take any notice. Old days, and Irene in grey silk, shot with palest green. He looked sideways at Fleur's face. Rather colourless, no light, no eagerness. That love affair was preying on her. A bad business. He looked beyond at his wife's face, rather more touched up than usual, a little disdainful. Not that she had any business to disdain, as far as he could see. She was taking Profond's defection with curious quietude. Or was his small voyage just a blind? If so, he should refuse to see it. Having promenaded round the pitch and in front of the pavilion, they sought Winifred's table in the Bedouin Club tent. This club, a new cock and hen, had been founded in the interests of travel, and of a gentleman with an old Scottish name, whose father had somewhat strangely been called Levi. Winifred had joined, not because she had travelled, but because instinct told her that a club with such a name and such a founder was bound to go far. If one didn't join at once, one might never have the chance. Its tent, with a text from the Koran on an orange ground, and a small green camel embroidered over the entrance, was the most striking on the ground. Outside it they found Jack Cardigan, in a dark blue tie (he had once played for Harrow), batting with a Malacca cane to show how that fellow ought to have hit that ball. He piloted them in. Assembled in Winifred's corner were Imogen, Benedict with his young wife, Val Dartie without Holly, Maud and her husband, and after Soames and his two were seated, one empty place. "I'm expecting Prosper," said Winifred, "but he's so busy with his yacht." Soames stole a glance. No movement in his wife's face. Whether that fellow were coming or not, she evidently knew all about it. It did not escape him that Fleur too looked at her mother. If Annette didn't respect his feelings, she might think of Fleur's. The conversation, very desultory, was syncopated by Jack Cardigan talking about mid-off. He cited all the great mid-offs from the beginning of time, as if they had been a definite racial entity in the composition of the British people. Soames had finished his lobster and was beginning on pigeon pie, when he heard the words, "I'm a small bit late, Mrs. Dartie," and saw that there was no longer any empty place. That fellow was sitting between Annette and Imogen. Soames ate steadily on, with an occasional word to Maud and Winifred. Conversation buzzed around him. He heard the voice of Profond say: "I think you're mistaken, Mrs. Forsyte." "I'll bet Miss Forsyte agrees with me." "In what?" came Fleur's clear voice across the table. "I was saying young girls are much the same as they always were. There's a very small difference." "Do you know so much about them?" That sharp reply caught the ears of all, and Soames moved uneasily on his thin green chair. "Well, I don't know. I think they want their own small way, and I think they always did." "Indeed!" "Oh, but Prosper," Winifred interjected comfortably, "the girls in the streets, the girls who've been in munitions, the little flappers in the shops, their manners now really quite hit you in the eye." At the word "hit," Jack Cardigan stopped his disquisition. And in the silence, Monsieur Profond said: "It was inside before, now it's outside, that's all." "But they're morals!" cried Imogen. "Just as moral as they ever were, Mrs. Cardigan. But they've got more opportunity." The saying, so cryptically cynical, received a little laugh from Imogen, a slight opening of Jack Cardigan's mouth, and a creak from Soames's chair. Winifred said: "That's too bad, Prosper." "What do you say, Mrs. Forsyte? Don't you think human nature's always the same?" Soames subdued a sudden longing to get up and kick the fellow. He heard his wife reply: "Human nature is not the same in England as everywhere else." That was her confounded mockery. "Well, I don't know much about this small country." No, thank God, thought Soames. But I should say the pot was boiling under the lid everywhere. We all want pleasure, and we always did. Damn the fellow! His cynicism was outrageous. When lunch was over, they broke up into couples for the digestive promenade. Too proud to notice, Soames knew perfectly that Annette and that fellow had gone prowling round together. Fleur was with Val. She had chosen him, no doubt, because he knew that boy. He himself had Winifred for partner. They walked in the bright circling stream, a little flushed and sated, for some minutes, till Winifred sighed: "I wish we were back 40 years, old boy." Before the eyes of her spirit an interminable procession of her own lord's frocks was passing, paid for with the money of her father, to save a recurrent crisis. "It's been very amusing after all. Sometimes I even wish Monty were back. What do you think of people nowadays, Soames?" "Precious little style. The thing began to go to pieces with bicycles and motor cars. The war has finished it." "I wonder what's coming," said Winifred in a voice dreamy from pigeon pie. "I'm not at all sure we shan't go back to crinolines and peg tops. Look at that dress." Soames shook his head. "There's money, but no faith in things. We don't lay by for the future. These youngsters, it's all a short life and a merry one with them." "There's a hat," said Winifred. "I don't know, when you come to think of the people killed and all that in the war, it's rather wonderful, I think. There's no other country. Prosper says the rest are all bankrupt except America, and of course her men always took their style in dress from us." "Is that chap," said Soames, "really going to the South Seas?" "Oh, one never knows where Prosper's going." "He's a sign of the times," muttered Soames, "if you like." Winifred's hand gripped his arm. "Don't turn your head," she said in a low voice, "but look to your right in the front row of the stand." Soames looked as best he could under that limitation. A man in a grey top hat, grey bearded, with thin brown folded cheeks and a certain elegance of posture, sat there with a woman in a lawn-coloured frock, whose dark eyes were fixed on himself. Soames looked quickly at his feet. How funnily feet moved, one after the other like that. Winifred's voice said in his ear: "Jolyon looks very ill, but he always had style. She doesn't change, except her hair." "Why did you tell Fleur about that business?" "I didn't. She picked it up. I always knew she would." "Well, it's a mess. She's set her heart upon that boy." "The little wretch!" murmured Winifred. "She tried to take me in about that. What shall you do, Soames?" "Be guided by events." They moved on, silent, in the almost solid crowd. "Really," said Winifred suddenly, "it almost seems like fate, only that's so old-fashioned. Look, there are George and Eustace." George Forsyte's lofty bulk had halted before them. "Hullo, Soames," he said. "Just met Profond and your wife. You'll catch 'em up if you put on pace. Did you ever go to see old Timothy?" Soames nodded, and the streams forced them apart. "I always liked old George," said Winifred. "He's so droll." "I never did," said Soames. "Where's your seat? I shall go to mine. Fleur may be back there." Having seen Winifred to her seat, He regained his own, conscious of small white distant figures running, the click of the bat, the cheers and counter-cheers. No Fleur and no Annette. You could expect nothing of women nowadays. They had the vote, they were emancipated, and much good was it doing them. So Winifred would go back, would she, and put up with Dartie all over again. To have the past once more, to be sitting here as he had sat in '83 and '84, before he was certain that his marriage with Irene had gone all wrong, before her antagonism had become so glaring that with the best will in the world he could not overlook it. The sight of her with that fellow had brought all memory back. Even now he could not understand why she had been so impracticable. She could love other men, she had it in her. To himself, the one person she ought to have loved, she had chosen to refuse her heart. It seemed to him, fantastically, as he looked back, that all this modern relaxation of marriage, though its forms and laws were the same as when he married her, that all this modern looseness had come out of her revolt. It seemed to him, fantastically, that she had started it, till all decent ownership of anything had gone, or was on the point of going. All came from her. And now, a pretty state of things. Homes! How could you have them without mutual ownership? Not that he had ever had a real home, but had that been his fault? He had done his best, and his rewards were those two sitting in that stand, and this affair of Fleur's. And overcome by loneliness, he thought, shan't wait any longer. They must find their own way back to the hotel, if they mean to come. Hailing a cab outside the ground, he said, "Drive me to the Bayswater Road." His old aunts had never failed him. To them he had meant an ever welcome visitor. Though they were gone, there still was Timothy. Smither was standing in the open doorway. "Mr. Soames, I was just taking the air. Cook will be so pleased." "How is Mr. Timothy?" "Not himself at all these last few days, sir. He's been talking a great deal. Only this morning he was saying to me, 'My brother James, he's getting old.' His mind wanders, Mr. Soames, and then he will talk of them. He troubles about their investments. The other day he said, 'There's my brother Jolyon won't look at consols.' He seemed quite down about it. Come in, Mr. Soames, come in. It's such a pleasant change." "Well," said Soames, "just for a few minutes." "No," murmured Smither in the hall, where the air had the singular freshness of the outside day. "We haven't been very satisfied with him, not all this week. He's always been one to leave a titbit to the end, but ever since Monday he's been eating it first. If you notice a dog, Mr. Soames, at its dinner, it eats the meat first. We've always thought it such a good sign of Mr. Timothy at his age to leave it till the last, but now he seems to have lost all his self-control, and of course it makes him leave the rest. The doctor doesn't make anything of it, but—" Smither shook her head. "He seems to think he's got to eat it first in case he shouldn't get to it. That and his talking makes us anxious." "Has he said anything important?" "Oh, I shouldn't like to say that, Mr. Soames, but he's turned against his will. He gets quite pettish, and after having had it out every morning for years, it does seem funny. He said the other day, 'They want my money.' He gave me such a turn, because, as I said to him, nobody wants his money, I'm sure, and it does seem a pity he should be thinking about money at his time of life. I took my courage in my hands. 'You know, Mr. Timothy,' I said, 'my dear mistress'—that's Miss Forsyte, Mr. Soames—Miss Anne that trained me. She never thought about money,' I said. 'It was all character with her.' He looked at me, I can't tell you how funny, and he said, quite dry, 'Nobody wants my character.' Think of his saying a thing like that! But sometimes he'll say something as sharp and sensible as anything." Soames, who had been staring at an old print by the hat rack, thinking, "That's got value," murmured, "I'll go up and see him, Smither." "Cook's with him," answered Smither above her corsets. "She will be pleased to see you." He mounted slowly, with the thought, Shan't care to live to be that age. On the second floor he paused and tapped. The door was opened, and he saw the round, homely face of a woman about 60. "Mr. Soames!" she said. "Why, Mr. Soames!" Soames nodded. "All right, cook?" and entered. Timothy was propped up in bed, with his hands joined before his chest, and his eyes fixed on the ceiling, where a fly was standing upside down. Soames stood at the foot of the bed, facing him. "Uncle Timothy," he said, raising his voice. "Uncle Timothy!" Timothy's eyes left the fly, and levelled themselves on his visitor. Soames could see his pale tongue passing over his darkish lips. "Uncle Timothy," he said again, "is there anything I can do for you? Is there anything you'd like to say?" "Ha!" said Timothy. "I've come to look you up and see that everything's all right." Timothy nodded. He seemed trying to get used to the apparition before him. "Have you got everything you want?" "No," said Timothy. "Can I get you anything?" "No," said Timothy. "I'm Soames, you know, your nephew, Soames Forsyte, your brother James's son." Timothy nodded. "I shall be delighted to do anything I can for you." Timothy beckoned. Soames went close to him. "You," said Timothy, in a voice which seemed to have outlived tone, "you tell them all from me. You tell them all," and his finger tapped on Soames's arm, "to hold on, hold on. Consols are going up." And he nodded thrice. "All right," said Soames, "I will." "Yes," said Timothy, and fixing his eyes again on the ceiling, he added, "that fly." Strangely moved, Soames looked at the cook's pleasant fattish face, all little puckers from staring at fires. "That'll do him the world of good, sir," she said. A mutter came from Timothy, but he was clearly speaking to himself, and Soames went out with the cook. "I wish I could make you a pink cream, Mr. Soames, like in old days. You did so relish them. Good-bye, sir. It's been a pleasure." "Take care of him, cook. He is old." And shaking her crumpled hand, he went downstairs. Smither was still taking the air in the doorway. "What do you think of him, Mr. Soames?" Soames murmured. "He's lost touch." "Yes," said Smither. "I was afraid you'd think that, coming fresh out of the world to see him like." "Smither," said Soames, "we're all indebted to you." "Oh no, Mr. Soames, don't say that. It's a pleasure. He's such a wonderful man." "Well, good bye," said Soames, and got into his taxi. Going up, he thought, going up. Reaching the hotel at Knightsbridge, he went to their sitting room and rang for tea. Neither of them were in, and again that sense of loneliness came over him. These hotels, what monstrous great places they were now! He could remember when there was nothing bigger than Long's or Brown's, Morley's or the Tavistock, and the heads that were shaken over the Langham and the Grand. Hotels and clubs, clubs and hotels, no end to them now. And Soames, who had just been watching at Lord's a miracle of tradition and continuity, fell into reverie over the changes in that London where he had been born 65 years before. Whether Consols were going up or not, London had become a terrific property. No such property in the world, unless it were New York. There was a lot of hysteria in the paper nowadays, but anyone who, like himself, could remember London 60 years ago, and see it now, realised the fecundity and elasticity of wealth. They had only to keep their heads and go at it steadily. Why, he remembered cobblestones and stinking straw on the floor of your cab. And old Timothy, what could he not have told them if he had kept his memory? Things were unsettled, people in a funk or in a hurry, but here were London and the Thames, and out there the British Empire and the ends of the earth. Consols are going up. He shouldn't be a bit surprised. It was the breed that counted. And all that was bull-dogged in Soames stared for a moment out of his grey eyes, till diverted by the print of a Victorian picture on the walls. The hotel had bought 3 dozen of that little lot. The old hunting or Rake's Progress prints in the old inns were worth looking at, but this sentimental stuff, well, Victorianism had gone. Tell them to hold on, old Timothy had said. But to what were they to hold on in this modern welter of the democratic principle? Why, even privacy was threatened. And at the thought that privacy might perish, Soames pushed back his teacup and went to the window. Fancy owning no more of nature than the crowd out there owned of the flowers and trees and waters of Hyde Park. No, no, private possession underlay everything worth having. The world had slipped its sanity a bit, as dogs now and again at full moon slipped theirs, and went off on a night's rabbiting. But the world, like the dog, knew where its bread was buttered and its bed warm, and would come back sure enough to the only home worth having, to private ownership. The world was in its second childhood for the moment, like old Timothy, eating its tit-bit first. He heard a sound behind him, and saw that his wife and daughter had come in. "So you're back," he said. Fleur did not answer. She stood for a moment looking at him and her mother, and then passed into her bedroom. Annette poured herself out a cup of tea. "I am going to Paris, to my mother, Soames." "Oh, to your mother?" "Yes." "For how long?" "I do not know." "And when are you going?" "On Monday." Was she really going to her mother? Odd how indifferent he felt. Odd how clearly she had perceived the indifference he would feel, so long as there was no scandal. And suddenly, between her and himself, he saw distinctly the face that he had seen that afternoon, Irene's. "Will you want money?" "Thank you, I have enough." "Very well. Let us know when you're coming back." Annette put down the cake she was fingering, and looking up through darkened lashes, said: "Shall I give Maman any message?" "My regards." Annette stretched herself, her hands on her waist, and said in French: "What luck you have never loved me, Soames." Then, rising, she too left the room. Soames was glad she had spoken it in French. It seemed to require no dealing with. Again, that other face, pale, dark-eyed, beautiful still. And there stirred, far down within him, the ghost of warmth, as from sparks lingering between a mound of flaky ash. And Fleur infatuated with her boy. Queer chance. Yet was there such a thing as chance? A man went down a street, a brick fell on his head. Ah, that was chance, no doubt. But this? Inherited, his girl had said. She was holding on. End of Part 2, Chapter 11. Chapter 1 of To Let. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Andy Minter. The Forsyte Saga. 3. To Let by John Galsworthy. Part 3, Chapter 1. Old Jolyon Walks. Twofold impulse had made Jolyon say to his wife at breakfast, "Let's go up to Lord's." Wanted something to abate the anxiety in which those two had lived during the 60 hours since John had brought Fleur down. Wanted, too, that which might assuage the pangs of memory in one who knew he might lose them any day. 58 years ago Jolyon had become an Eton boy, for old Jolyon's whim had been that he should be canonised at the greatest possible expense. Year after year he had gone to Lord's from Stanhope Gate with a father whose youth in the 1820s had been passed without polish in the game of cricket, Old Jolyon would speak quite openly of swipes, full tosses, half and three-quarter balls, and young Jolyon, with the guileless snobbery of youth, had trembled lest his sire should be overheard. Only in this supreme matter of cricket he had been nervous, for his father, in Crimean whiskers then, had ever impressed him as the beau ideal. Though never canonised himself, old Jolyon's natural fastidiousness and balance had saved him from the errors of the vulgar. How delicious, after howling in a top hat and a sweltering heat, to go home with his father in a hansom cab, bathe, dress, and forth to the Disunion Club, to dine off whitebait, cutlets, and a tart, and go, two swells, old and young, in lavender kid gloves, to the opera or play. And on Sunday, when the match was over and his top hat duly broken, down with his father in a special hansom to the Crown and Sceptre, and the terrace above the river, the golden sixties, when the world was simple, dandies glamorous, democracy not born, and the books of White Melville coming thick and fast. A generation later, with his own boy, Jolly, Harrow buttonholed with cornflowers, by old Jolyon's whim his grandson had been canonised at a trifle less expense. Again Jolyon had experienced the heat and counter-passions of the day, and come back to the cool and strawberry beds of Robin Hill, and billiards after dinner, his boy making the most heartbreaking flukes and trying to seem languid and grown up. Those 2 days each year he and his son had been alone together in the world, one on each side, and democracy just born. And so he had unearthed a grey top hat, borrowed a tiny bit of light blue ribbon from Irene, and gingerly, keeping cool by car and train and taxi, had reached Lord's ground. There, beside her in a lawn-coloured frock with narrow black edges, he had watched the game, and felt the old thrill stir within him. When Soames passed, the day was spoiled. Irene's face was distorted by compression of the lips. No good to go on sitting here with Soames, or perhaps his daughter, recurring in front of them, like decimals. And he said, "Well, dear, if you've had enough, let's go." That evening Jolyon felt exhausted. Not wanting her to see him thus, he waited till she had begun to play, and stole off to the little study. He opened the long window for air, and the door that he might still hear her music drifting in, and, settled in his father's old armchair, closed his eyes, with his head against the worn brown leather. Like that passage of the César Franck sonata, so had been his life with her, a divine third movement. And now this business of John's, this bad business. Drifted to the edge of consciousness, he hardly knew if it were in sleep that he smelled the scent of a cigar, and seemed to see his father in the blackness before his closed eyes. That shape formed, went, and formed again, as if in the very chair where he himself was sitting. He saw his father, black-coated, with knees crossed, glasses balanced between thumb and finger, saw the big white moustaches and the deep eyes looking up below a dome of forehead and seeming to search his own, seeming to speak. "Are you facing it, Joe? It's for you to decide. She's only a woman." Ah, how well he knew his father in that phrase, how all the Victorian age came up with it. And his answer: "No, I've funked it. Funked hurting her and John and myself. I've got a heart. I've funked it." But the old eyes, so much older, so much younger than his own, kept at it. "It's your wife, your son, your past. Tackle it, my boy." Was it a message from walking spirit, or but the instinct of his sire living on within him? And again came that scent of cigar smoke from the old saturated leather. Well, he would tackle it, write to John and put the whole thing down in black and white. And suddenly he breathed with difficulty, with a sense of suffocation, as if his heart were swollen. He got up and went out into the air. The stars were very bright. He passed along the terrace, round the corner of the house, till through the window of the music-room he could see Irene at the piano, with lamplight falling on her powdery hair. Withdrawn into herself she seemed, her dark eyes staring straight before her, her hands idle. Jolyon saw her raise those hands and clasp them over her breast. "It's John with her," he thought, "all John. I'm dying out of her. It's natural." And, careful not to be seen, he stole back. Next day, after a bad night, he sat down to his task. He wrote, with difficulty and many erasures: "My dearest boy, you are old enough to understand how very difficult it is for elders to give themselves away to their young, especially when, like your mother and myself, though I shall never think of her as anything but young, their hearts are altogether set on him to whom they must confess. I cannot say we are conscious of having sinned exactly. People in real life very seldom are, I believe. But most persons would say we had, and at all events our conduct, righteous or not, has found us out. The truth is, my dear, we both have pasts, which it is now my task to make known to you, because they so grievously and deeply affect your future. Many, very many years ago, as far back indeed as 1883, when she was only 20, your mother had the great and lasting misfortune to make an unhappy marriage. No, not with me, John. Without money of her own, and with only a stepmother closely related to Jezebel, she was very unhappy in her home life. It was Fleur's father that she married, my cousin, Soames Forsyte. He had pursued her very tenaciously, and, to do him justice, was deeply in love with her. Within a week she knew the fearful mistake she had made. It was not his fault, it was her error of judgment, her misfortune. So far, Jolyon had kept some semblance of irony, but now his subject carried him away. "John, I want to explain to you, if I can, and it's very hard, how it is that an unhappy marriage such as this can so easily come about. You will, of course, say, if she didn't really love him, how could she ever have married him? You would be right, if it were not for one or two rather terrible considerations. From this initial mistake of hers, all the subsequent trouble, sorrow, and tragedy have come. And so I must make it clear to you, if I can. You see, John, in those days, and even to this day, indeed, I don't see, for all the talk of enlightenment, how it can well be otherwise. Most girls are married ignorant of the sexual side of life. Even if they know what it means, they have not experienced it. That's the crux. It's this actual lack of experience, whatever verbal knowledge they have, which makes all the difference and all the trouble. In a vast number of marriages, and your mother's was one, girls are not and cannot be certain whether they love the man they marry or not. They do not know until after that act of union which makes the reality of marriage. Now, in many cases, perhaps in most doubtful cases, this act cements and strengthens the attachment. But in other cases, and your mother's was one, it is a revelation of mistake, a destruction of such attraction as there was. There is nothing more tragic in a woman's life than such a revelation, growing daily, nightly clearer. Coarse-grained and unthinking people are apt to laugh at such a mistake and say, "What a fuss about nothing." Narrow and self-righteous people, only capable of judging the lives of others by their own, are apt to condemn those who make this tragic error, to condemn them for life to the dungeons they have made for themselves. You know the expression, "She has made her bed, she must lie on it." It is a hard-mouthed saying, quite unworthy of a gentleman or lady in the best sense of these words, and I can use no stronger condemnation. I have not been what is called a moral man, but I wish to use no words to you, my dear, which will make you think lightly of ties or contracts into which you enter. Heaven forbid! But with the experience of a life behind me, I do say that those who condemn the victims of these tragic mistakes, condemn them and hold out no hands to help them, are inhuman, or rather they would be if they had the understanding to know what they are doing, but they haven't. Let them go. They are as much anathema to me as I, no doubt, am to them. I have had to say all this because I am going to put you into a position to judge your mother, and you are very young, without experience of what life is. To go on with the story. After 3 years of efforts to subdue her shrinking, I was going to say her loathing, and it's not too strong a word, for shrinking soon becomes loathing under such circumstances. 3 years of what to a sensitive, beauty-loving nature like your mother's, John, was torment. She met a young man who fell in love with her. He was the architect of this very house that we live in now. He was building it for her and Fleur's father to live in, a new prison to hold her, in place of the one she inhabited with him in London. Perhaps that fact played some part in what came of it, but in any case she too fell in love with him. I know it's not necessary to explain to you that one does not precisely choose with whom one will fall in love. It comes. Very well, it came. I can imagine, though she never said much to me about it, the struggle that then took place in her, because, John, she was brought up strictly, and was not light in her ideas, not at all. However, this was an overwhelming feeling, and it came to pass that they loved in deed as well as in thought. Then came a fearful tragedy. I must tell you of it, because if I don't, you will never understand the real situation that you now have to face. The man whom she married, Soames Forsyte, the father of Fleur, one night, at the height of her passion for this young man, forcibly reasserted his rights over her. The next day she met her lover and told him of it. Whether he committed suicide, or whether he was accidentally run over in his distraction, we never knew, but so it was. Think of your mother as she was that evening, when she heard of his death. I happened to see her. Your grandfather sent me to help her if I could. I only just saw her, before the door was shut against me by her husband. But I have never forgotten her face. I can see it now. I was not in love with her then, not for 12 years after, but I have never forgotten. My dear boy, it is not easy to write like this, but you see I must. Your mother is wrapped up in you, utterly, devotedly. I don't wish to write harshly of Soames Forsyte. I don't think harshly of him. I have long been sorry for him. Perhaps I was sorry even then. As the world judges, she was in error, he within his rights. He loved her, in his way. She was his property. That is the view he holds of life, of human feelings and hearts. Property. It was not his fault. So he was born. To me it is a view that has always been abhorrent. So was I born. Knowing you as I do, I feel it cannot be otherwise than abhorrent to you. Let me go on with the story. Your mother fled from his house that night. For 12 years she lived quietly, alone, without companionship of any sort, until in 1899 her husband—you see he was still her husband, for he did not attempt to divorce her, and she, of course, had no right to divorce him—became conscious, it seems, of the want of children, and commenced a long attempt to induce her to go back to him and give him a child. I was her trustee then, under your grandfather's will, and I watched this going on. While watching, I became attached to her, devotedly attached. His pressure increased, till one day she came to me here and practically put herself under my protection. Her husband, who was kept informed of all her movements, attempted to force us apart by bringing a divorce suit. Or possibly he really meant it. I don't know. But anyway, our names were publicly joined. That decided us, and we became united in fact. She was divorced, married me, and you were born. We have lived in perfect happiness, at least I have, and I believe your mother also. Soames, soon after the divorce, married Fleur's mother, and she was born. That is the story, John. I have told it you, because, by the affection which we see you have formed for this man's daughter, you are blindly moving forward to what must utterly destroy your mother's happiness, if not your own. I don't wish to speak of myself, because at my age there's no use supposing I shall cumber the ground much longer. Besides, what I should suffer would be mainly on her account and on yours. But what I want you to realise is that feelings of horror and aversion such as those can never be buried or forgotten. They are alive in her today. Only yesterday, at Lord's, we happened to see Soames Forsyte. Her face, if you had seen it, would have convinced you. The idea that you should marry his daughter is a nightmare to her, John. I have nothing to say against Fleur, save that she is his daughter. But your children, if you married her, would be the grandchildren of Soames as much as of your mother, of a man who once owned your mother as a man might own a slave. Think what that would mean. By such a marriage you enter the camp which held your mother prisoner, and wherein she ate her heart out. You are just on the threshold of life. You have only known this girl 2 months, and however deeply you think you love her, I appeal to you to break it off at once. Don't give your mother this rankling pain and humiliation during the rest of her life. Young though she will always seem to me, she is 57. Except for us two, she has no one in the world. She will soon only have you. Pluck up your spirit, John, and break away. Don't put this cloud and barrier between you. Don't break her heart. Bless you, my dear boy, and again forgive me for all the pain that this letter must bring you. We tried to spare it you, but Spain, it seems, was no good. Ever your devoted father, Jolyon Forsyte. Having finished his confession, Jolyon sat with a thin cheek on his hand, rereading. There were things in it which hurt him so much when he thought of John reading them, that he nearly tore the letter up. To speak of such things at all to a boy, his own boy, to speak of them in relation to his own wife and the boy's own mother, seemed dreadful to the reticence of his Forsyte soul. And yet, without speaking of them, how make John understand the reality, the deep cleavage, the ineffaceable scar? Without them, how justify this stifling of the boy's love? He might just as well not write at all. He folded the confession and put it in his pocket. It was, thank heaven, Saturday. He had till Sunday evening to think it over, for even if posted now it could not reach John till Monday. He felt a curious relief at this delay, and at the fact that, whether sent or not, it was written. In the rose garden, which had taken the place of the old fernery, he could see Irene snipping and pruning, with a little basket on her arm. She was never idle, it seemed to him, and he envied her now that he himself was idle nearly all his time. He went down to her. She held up a stained glove and smiled. A piece of lace tied under her chin concealed her hair, and her oval face, with its still dark brows, looked very young. "The green fly are awful this year, and yet it's cold. You look tired, Jolyon." Jolyon took the confession from his pocket. "I've been writing this. I think you ought to see it." "To John?" Her whole face had changed, in that instant, becoming almost haggard. "Yes, the murder's out." He gave it to her, and walked away among the roses. Presently, seeing that she had finished reading and was standing quite still, with the sheets of the letter against her skirt, he came back to her. "Well?" "It's wonderfully put. I don't see how it could be put better. Thank you, dear." "Is there anything you would like left out?" She shook her head. "No, he must know all if he's to understand." "That's what I thought, but I hate it." He had the feeling that he hated it more than she. To him, sex was so much easier to mention between man and woman than between man and man, and she had always been more natural and frank, not deeply secretive, like his Forsyte self. "I wonder if he will understand, even now, Jolyon. He's so young, and he shrinks from the physical." "He gets that shrinking from my father. He was as fastidious as a girl in all such matters. Would it be better to rewrite the whole thing, and just say you hated Soames?" Irene shook her head. "Hate's only a word. It conveys nothing. No, better as it is." "Very well. It shall go tomorrow." She raised her face to his, and in sight of the big house's many creepered windows, he kissed her. End of Part 3, Chapter 1.